Please note this episode contains discussions of sexual assault, rape, and abuse, and includes explicit language which may be distressing. Listener and viewer discretion advised. Hi, this is Tracy Height-Smith. Welcome to Open Stance, the podcast. In this episode, I am joined by a truly remarkable and prominent Australian leader, Dr. Cathy Kezelman AM. Cathy is the president and CEO of the Blue Knot Foundation, the National Center of Excellence for Complex Trauma. This organization is driven by their vision to reach the more than 1 in 4 adult Australians impacted by complex trauma. Cathy was recognized in 2015 by the Australian government when she was awarded the AM, Member of the Order, for significant service to community health as a supporter and advocate for survivors of child abuse. Cathy speaks with us from a place of intense personal understanding and compassion, as she is a survivor who lost a decade of her childhood to sexual abuse. Her story is bravely shared in her memoir, Innocence Revisited, A Tale in Parts. Listeners will hear from Cathy crucially important information, education, and understanding around what is complex trauma, how these experiences can present in childhood, adulthood, and into old age, and what options are available for people to receive specialized trauma-informed support. But the most resounding message Cathy shares in this episode is a message of hope. As a prominent leader, medical professional, and advocate, Cathy stays focused on the message that recovery and healing from complex trauma is absolutely possible. Thank you, Cathy, for this profound contribution of information, education, and support. It is my privilege and honor to welcome you to Open Stance. Good morning, Cathy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Just for our listeners, are you able to give us a little snapshot of where you're tuning in from today?
So I'm in Sydney. I'm on Gadigal land, and it's wonderful country here. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for taking your time. Cathy, maybe just a little to begin. Can we kick off with just a little bit about who you are and who the Blue Knot Foundation is? You are the president of the Blue Knot Foundation, which is also referred to as Australia's National Center of Excellence for Complex Trauma. So if you could give us a little understanding of your role, a little bit of your journey and who this organization is, please.
Yeah, so I'm a mother and a grandmother. I'm also an ex-GP, but I'm someone who started dealing with their own childhood trauma, child sexual and emotional abuse in my mid-40s. And that took me on quite the journey. And what it did was to motivate me and make me passionate about finding ways for people to heal. I was privileged in that I could find good support. But even then, I know how tough that journey was, not just for me, but, for my children and my husband and the people around me. So that's what drives me. And Blue Knot is an organization that I originally went to when it was called ASCA for support as part of my journey. And that was quite some time ago, but it's evolved now into a national organization that seeks to empower recovery for people who've experienced complex trauma. And by complex trauma, we mean people who've experienced often repeated, often extreme, ongoing experiences of abuse, neglect, violence as a child, as a young person, or as an adult. And unfortunately, we estimate that that's more than 5 million Australian adults. So that's that's an incredibly large number. My role is as president, CEO, and the organisation runs a number of helplines for survivors of childhood trauma, supports people with institutional child sexual abuse going through the redress scheme, supports people with disability who have experiences of violence, neglect, abuse, exploitation. And we also provide a lot of training and supervision to practitioners, workers from lots and lots of sectors around how to respond to people who have trauma experiences, how to support people with complex trauma towards healing and recovery, and how to also manage their own self-care, because when you're working with people who have experiences of trauma, you're also exposed to trauma stories and trauma material, and that can have an impact as well. So it's a big brief.
Yes. And in terms of when you're specifically speaking about complex trauma, what should we understand about that in particular, as opposed to just trauma? So if somebody sees your foundation, how do they know if that's for them or what it is?
Yeah, so when people think about trauma, they think about what we call single incident trauma. So the trauma of a flood or a bushfire, and we've seen way too many of those recently. An accident or a single assault as an adult, and never to minimize the impacts of that trauma. But with complex trauma, we're talking about, repeated trauma over time, and often as a child. And when a child is repeatedly abused or violated, and often by the very people who are meant to care and protect them, that has profound impacts on the way the child develops, on the very sense of self, on their physical and mental health, their well-being, their ability to complete an education, to learn, to explore the world, and to connect and have healthy relationships. But what we know, not just from the research, and there's a lot of research, but also from people's inspiring stories of healing and recovery, is that people can and do recover from childhood trauma. And it's really important to know that, the brain changes. When I was a medical student, I learned that you got a certain number of neurons and they gradually just died. Now, that wasn't really great news, but now we know that they can repair and that new pathways can be laid down. And that happens in the context of healthy, supportive relationships, just as people are harmed in relationships that are damaging, so people heal in relationships.
That is such a powerful message to spread as much as we can, as far and wide as we can. So that would bring us to some important knowledge or education. How can people that are aware of their traumas or have had first disclosures as an adult, how do they find you, and who's available to request your services or benefit from the Blue Knot Foundation?
Yeah, and it can be very confusing for people who, may wonder why they're struggling in life, may wonder why things apparently seem simple for others, but yet they're really struggling to get to first base. And it can be very hard to make the connections between what happened to you, often as a child, and, how you're struggling now. So, making those connections can be difficult. And what people find very helpful in the first instance is to read about it, to actually do their own discovery, to see why it is they feel so different, why they may struggle to connect with people, to feel safe, to trust. And it's so important that people understand that being abused as a child or being violated or neglected is never a child's fault. But many people do carry a sense of shame and self-blame. So we call this psychoeducation, which is finding information that actually helps you understand what happened to you and how that may have affected your brain, your body, your mind, why you may struggle, but yet, as we talked about before, those possibilities for healing and finding, a life that's full of meaning and connection. And so people will go to the website in the first instance. And so that's blueknot.org.au, and there's a lot of information there. There's a lot of fact sheets that can be downloaded, videos, and lots of information, and that really helps. But calling our helpline, and it's called the Blue Knot helpline, and speaking to a counsellor, a trauma-informed counsellor, someone who's experienced in understanding some of the challenges that many survivors experience, and just can be there to listen, to hear, to believe, and to support someone in the moment, find out what it is they need to help them feel safe, and acknowledging how courageous it is to make that first phone call, to reach out. And we hear from people disclosing for the first time in their 60s and 70s. They've never told a soul, but their life has been impacted for a long time because of their trauma experiences. And, just having someone listen, not try and fix it, not try and shut them down, but also help them to learn how to settle their often very strong emotions and to normalize what they're feeling, to provide them with some strategies to ground themselves, to soothe themselves, and then really find out, how it is, what it is that they need for ongoing support.
It would be a really nice time right now if you could share some specific examples for adults in particular, that when you talk about the impact of, say, childhood trauma or sexual abuse and how it is manifesting in their daily life, and they might not even be aware of it. On the surface, you could see addictions and some unhealthy behaviors, but underneath is the core. So even things like when you refer in the past to somebody who's a workaholic, how do you put the connection for people together to say, as you eloquently said, is manifesting, they don't feel right and there's something not right. Yeah. What are some of those symptoms that might seem really normal or not associated to a trauma that actually are?
Yeah, it's about, how you start to make those connections. And, we need to be careful here that, people experience a lot of symptoms and they don't all mean that someone's experienced trauma, but many people can struggle with anxiety or panic attacks or depression and all sorts of mental health impacts. But, and often what happens is that they present to particular services who don't have a trauma lens. So treatment will respond to their presenting symptom, to their depression, to their anxiety, but why, is someone struggling with their mental health? What happened to them along life's journey, rather than, using a lens of what is wrong with them. And we call this being trauma informed. People may struggle with their sense of self. They may have a really low self-esteem. Often people do blame themselves. Feeling a very overwhelming sense of shame is a very common symptom or presentation of people who've experienced childhood trauma. And that shame has unfortunately often been reinforced by our society, which has treated victims, often blamed victims for their own victimhood, and treated them with stigma and discrimination. It's starting to change now, and we're starting to have conversations such as this one, which show that this isn't about a them and us. We all have things that impact us along life's journey. But if you've experienced, repeated abuse, for example, just imagine a child who's sexually abused within the family from the ages of, 4 to 15. How do they make sense of the fact that a family member who is meant to love and care for them, in some way probably does, is also harming them so profoundly? And that affects the way the brain develops. It affects the way you bond and attach to other people, and sets up a cycle of distrust, lack of safety. Some people, who experience childhood trauma have never felt safe. And that's a really challenging concept. So it's not about them reclaiming a sense of safety. It's about how do they actually find a safe space within themselves, in relationships with other people, and in relationships with the world. There are many, many different presentations. And the other important message, I suppose, is thinking about coping strategies. So people who've experienced this sort of trauma often experience a lot of angst and distress, and do whatever they can, as we all do, to lower that distress And that may involve using substances, overusing prescribed medication, as you said, workaholism, addictions to a whole range of things. It may also cause you to withdraw and shut down. So there's a whole range of ways people try and cope. And often the service system traditionally has judged that and judged people for their own sort of incapacity to cope, judge people who are addicted to alcohol and drugs without understanding why,
Sure.
And
just to wrap that up a bit, when you mention people in their 60s are having their first disclosures for the first time, what message are these? Well, let me ask, are these people going to stuff that down because at 60 they think, how in the heck how could I even begin this journey? Or what are you seeing? Are people in their 60s coming to you for help? Are they receiving help and finding a pathway at that age?
Look, everyone's an individual, so there's no generalizations at any age, and often people do not present till their 40s, 50s. It's not unusual to not present with issues related to childhood trauma and abuse till older. Some people, calling the helpline for the first time, they may have, just been struggling in their lives for so long, and they've got to a point where, they just need help. And yeah, definitely people can find pathways at that age, absolutely. And they can find support, and they can start to make sense of, what's gone on for them in the preceding decades, and start to shift that self-blame and shame, and find, we do quite a lot of work with people in correctional centres on the phone. And that's been quite profound work. These are people with disability who've had experiences of violence. And obviously they've also perpetrated violence because they're inmates. But what we hear from them is that, perhaps they're not evil after all. It's not about what they've done. I mean, obviously, they're imprisoned for what they've done, but it's also about what was done to them, and the way they've responded to the trauma is obviously not constructive, with violence and, perpetrating violence, but yet it needs to be understood. And for them, it's often profound that they're being treated for the first time in their lives as human beings. And they're starting to understand that they're not perhaps inherently evil, but what was done to them was evil. And that, and that can really start, quite substantial period of rehabilitation.
Fascinating. I guess that leads to my next question, which is the big one. What is the demand for your services, Cathy, looking like right now, present day? And I start with that. And then the follow-up question is, how are you meeting the demands?
Yeah. Look, the demand on our helpline is always way more than we are resourced to respond to. So we are funded federally, and we're obviously most grateful for that funding. But we have a helpline that just rings incessantly, and we have, I'm trying to think of how many counsellors, probably about 30 counsellors across our helplines who share those calls, and they work hard. And it's challenging work. And obviously it's work that's, you're there to, hear and listen to people's trauma and contain them and support them. And so there's a lot of support that we also need to provide to our team to keep them healthy and well. But we probably miss almost as many calls as we're able to answer. And that's just awful, because when we think of, people on the other end of the phone, who are unable to get through, and what's also critical is that people call at the point at which they, want to speak. And people can leave a number for us to call back if they choose. But often if we do, then, the moment has passed in a way. And so it would be obviously ideal if we were able to respond to everyone who needs our support and care, because what our service offers is it's a different sort of support to, and there's lots of good helplines, who provide all sorts of different, often mental health support and different forms of support. But this is about talking to people who specialize in supporting people with complex trauma and really do understand. And we hear, that people call us to the line and just so grateful. They've tried other services. They haven't felt understood. They've often, received multiple diagnoses, not to say that those diagnoses are not true, but what we know is that, and this was my own experience, that once I received good support, the diagnoses I had sort of melted away over time, because it was about my underlying trauma, and that's what needed to be addressed.
And what would be the second step from the first phone call? What happens after that? How does the person progress from there if it's more than a phone call?
Yeah, again, there's a whole range of responses because people are individuals, and some people will ring, a number of times, and it's about us trying to find out what it is they need or what would benefit them. And part of that is about supporting them to understand their own internal strengths, to look around them to see who may be there in their support network, and to see, whether they want referrals to their local areas, to practitioners, where they want to go down a counselling route, whether they're looking for other supports in their life. And many people, as I say, are just are struggling with daily life, whether it's finding a stable home or navigating the disability support pension, or so there's all sorts of different needs that need to be navigated. And so we try and connect people up with where they're going to find the appropriate support.
In terms of counseling specifically, what type of demand do you have for people that actually go to the next step and really feel that counseling or some type of treatment, trauma-informed treatment, would be the right step for them, especially in terms of how can you service that, or in today's world, mental telehealth and the availability and the affordability and the quality of it, now that we can use modern day technology where people don't actually have to go to the office. What's the demand for that? Can you service it, or is that a component that would be very impactful to add to what you already do?
And we have a referral database that we've established of practitioners who've gone through an application process to establish whether we believe they have the capacity to support people who've experienced complex trauma, to support them in a therapeutic way. And so we've got practitioners and agencies on that database, but that database has big holes in it, and particularly regionally and rurally. And so, it would be very, very important to build the resources, so those referral pathways. And obviously, part of that is about, people deciding, who's a fit for them. So it's, and we like to give people choice. That's a trauma-informed principle, providing choice. But having a service system that is able to support the needs, and, that's often said about the mental health space, but for people who are presenting not just with mental health issues, but other issues related to complex trauma, it's even more nuanced. And the training required, which is why we have such a big training arm of practitioners, and the particular skills are really critical. And we know that this is an area that is improving, but there's a lot more work to be done in terms of building workforce capacity and in terms of building services that are there to really respond to survivors, for as long as they require those services. We know that people dip in and out of counselling over their lifetime, but it's about accessible, affordable, skilled counselling when it is that they're ready to access it, and if they have particular needs at the time, and they may then, as I say, dip out. But then again, another time there may be a new level of processing that they're looking for, or a different sort of support. And there's lots of different ways people approach counselling for complex traumas, many modalities.
Yeah, and I guess from a survivor point of view, and this also comes from my own personal experience, where the first counselor that you go to or meet with is not necessarily the one for you. And such good advice is, if there's not a fit that first time, keep going, keep trying. But this is a very complicated piece of advice when getting to any counselor's office in the first place is nearly impossible on many levels for most people, whether it's affordability or time or a fearfulness. So in my experience, I had a few and then found a fit. But what if it's 10? What if it's 12? And then looking at the ability and knowing that is potentially going to happen to people, being able to have those initial counseling sessions on your phone, in your own home, or when we were talking about rural and regional areas where the nearest town is not close at all. So there's all those barriers that you can knock down in terms of using your phone, for example, so that if you have to meet with 10 counselors for treatment, not only through the Blue Knot Foundation or your partnerships, are you certain that you're getting the specialized and the trauma-informed counseling? You also, in the privacy of your own home, can have more frequency to try and find a fit that is going to be successful and give you a bit more hope, I would imagine, in terms of getting to that next level of your recovery.
And I think one of the, positive outcomes of COVID, I suppose, if there is one, is that we've all learned a lot more about telehealth, and it's busted some of the myths about what we thought we couldn't do, over the phone or video conferencing or whatever. And we also have web chat, whatever it is. And that, a lot of people also enjoy the anonymity, not enjoy, that's the wrong word, but the anonymity, particularly when there's so much shame initially to reach out, over the phone can be really quite a benefit. And, traditionally telehealth was seen as a poor cousin of face-to-face, but that's certainly changed enormously now. And we're finding that, people can feel supported and build a strong therapeutic relationship over time. And we do this in our correctional centre work. That's sort of sessional work over a period of time. And as is the work we do in supporting people through the redress scheme. They're meeting over often a year or two on a weekly, fortnightly basis with counselling over the phone or video conferencing. So, we are using telehealth in circumstances ourselves over a long period of time. And we actually find that, the therapeutic alliance, is actually very, very strong and powerful, even though it's telehealth. Yeah.
That's amazing. Gosh. Well, I just wrapping it up to, I guess, it would be really important to address the fact that the demand is so high for these services for a number of reasons. What could you offer, Cathy, in terms of, if you're that person that picked up the phone and found the courage to make that first phone call, but you were actually, you couldn't get through or turned away or whatever happens and not connected, what can we speak to in terms of that for people listening?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the advice is to keep trying. Leave a message if you feel comfortable to. And, it's very, very difficult because, there are, other good services around, but we also know that we do have the skills and the specialisation to support people with this background. So obviously we would be very keen to continue to expand this service in any way we can, because we just know the demand. And it's very, very important for us to ensure that we have the the appropriately skilled staff. And, as a result, we used to just recruit people from Sydney and New South Wales, but now we've extended it, right up the eastern seaboard to ensure that we are able to have, trauma counsellors that have their own self-care and support systems, and we of course wrap around a lot of supports for them, but are also able to hold and support people in the way we've discussed and keep people safe.
Yep. Well, do you have anything coming up in the future, or do you have a few words just to share with the listeners on, again, how to reach you or any events coming up? I know you have a newsletter, just a little bit to offer listeners that might want to explore your organization or connect.
Yeah, so blueknot.org.au, that's BLUEKNOT. You'll find a lot of information and resources there. Our helpline is 1300 657 380, and it operates 9 to 5, Monday to Sunday. So yeah, I suppose the final message that there is hope and there is help, and that healing is absolutely possible. So please, reach out, and, not just to support from Blue Knot, but, see who's around you as well for support.
Dr. Cathy Kezelman, thank you for your time. That's very powerful, profound information that you've shared. And on behalf of many people listening, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Tracy. That was a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, have a super day, and we'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Cathy.
Bye.
Bye.